There are two kinds of people in this world, and you can usually tell them apart by what they do on a Sunday afternoon when nobody is watching and nobody is expecting anything from them. One kind gets restless. The silence starts to feel like a problem. They reach for their phone, text someone, start making plans, look up events nearby, anything to fill the gap. The other kind exhales. They pull the blinds just enough to get that soft, filtered light. They make something warm to drink. They sit down in their favorite spot, and something in their body physically releases, like a held breath finally let go. If you recognized yourself in that second description, this video was built for you. Because what you're about to hear is not about introversion in the shallow social media sense. It's about something deeper, something your nervous system has been doing for years that nobody ever gave you the right language for. And here's what makes this strange. The people who genuinely love being home, not as an escape from something bad, but as a destination in itself, are often the ones most misunderstood by the people closest to them. They get called antisocial. They get told they're wasting their youth. They get the comments about how they need to get out more. But research into individual differences in arousal, sensory processing, and what psychologists call restorative environments suggests something completely different. These people aren't retreating from life. In many cases, they're actually living more deliberately than the ones who never stop moving. If something in that already resonates with you, take a second and subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment below telling me which you are, the one who needs to fill the silence, or the one who finally breathes when the house goes quiet. That question alone tells you something real about how your mind is organized, and the more people share that, the richer this conversation gets. Now let's actually get into it. Most people assume that preferring to stay home is a personality trait in the casual sense, like preferring coffee over tea. Something minor, something you could override if you just tried a little harder, but that framing completely misses what's actually happening physiologically in people who experience home as genuinely restorative. The difference starts earlier than most people realize. In the 1960s, the psychologist Hans Eysenck proposed that introverts and extroverts don't just behave differently socially, they have fundamentally different baseline levels of cortical arousal. In simpler terms, the nervous system of someone who loves stillness is already running closer to its optimal stimulation point. At a crowded room, a loud restaurant, overlapping conversations, and unpredictable social demands, and that system tips over into overstimulation. It doesn't feel like fun. It feels, neurologically speaking, like too much. But here's where it gets more interesting, because this isn't just about introversion in the way the internet talks about it. The people who genuinely love their home environment as a place of deep engagement, not just hiding, often score high on a trait researchers call openness to experience, combined with a strong preference for what's called low arousal positive affect. That's a precise psychological term for the specific emotional state where you feel good, calm, content, satisfied without needing high stimulation to get there. Joy that doesn't require noise. Happiness that doesn't need an audience. And here's what's wild. In a culture that treats excitement and activity as the gold standard of well-being, people who naturally access that calm, contented state at home are often told they're missing out, when cognitively and emotionally, they may actually be doing something quite sophisticated. Because what does a rich inner life actually look like from the outside? It looks like someone sitting quietly. It looks like someone rereading a book they already know. It looks like someone who declines the invitation without guilt, who doesn't feel the need to justify a Saturday spent mostly alone. From the outside, it looks like nothing. From the inside, something else is happening entirely. There's a concept in environmental psychology called restorative environments. The idea, developed by researchers Rachel and Stephen Kaplan in the 1980s, is that certain environments have the capacity to replenish directed attention, reduce mental fatigue, and bring the mind back to a state of clarity. Their research identified 4 components that make an environment restorative: being away, a sense of extent, meaning a world that feels whole and engaging in itself, fascination, and compatibility with what you want to do. What's remarkable is that for people who have built their home environment deliberately, their space often meets all 4 of those criteria. The home becomes the away. The combination of familiar objects, sensory details, routines, and personal meaning creates a world that feels complete. The mind can wander into fascination, into thought, into creativity, without being pulled in 17 social directions at once. And because you're in control of what happens there, compatibility is almost total. This is not nothing. This is actually what the brain needs to process, integrate, and function at a high level. The insight you had in the shower wasn't an accident. The problem you solved while doing dishes wasn't luck. When the brain is released from the constant social monitoring that happens in public, something called the default mode network becomes more active. This is the network associated with mind wandering, self-reflection, imaginative simulation, creative thinking, and making sense of complex emotional experiences. For people who love being home, that network gets a lot of practice. Let's slow down on that for a moment, because it's one of the most underappreciated things about solitude-preferring people. The default mode network isn't idle when you're daydreaming. It's doing something that directed, task-focused attention can't do as easily. It's connecting disparate pieces of information, building narrative coherence, simulating social scenarios, processing unresolved experiences. In people who regularly give that network the space to run, you tend to see stronger capacities for self-awareness, empathy, counterintuitive as that might sound, long-range planning, and creative problem-solving. The stereotype of the homebody as unproductive gets it almost exactly backwards. Now, there's a distinction that matters here, and it's one that psychology takes seriously even when popular conversation doesn't. There's a difference between solitude chosen and solitude imposed. There's a difference between staying home because the space genuinely restores and expands you, and staying home because the outside world has started to feel threatening in a way you can't quite explain. Both can look identical from the outside. Both might involve canceled plans, quiet weekends, a strong preference for familiar surroundings, but they feel completely different from the inside, and they have different psychological signatures. The first kind, chosen restorative solitude, tends to come with a quality of agency. You could go out. You're choosing not to. The second kind can carry a quality of relief that bleeds into avoidance, where the home stops being a place you run toward and starts being a place you hide in because the alternative feels impossible. Understanding which one you're living is genuinely important. Not as a judgment, but as information, because the person living the first kind can probably articulate, when asked honestly, exactly what they get from their home time. The person living the second kind often finds the question harder to answer, because the real answer isn't about what the home gives them. It's about what the outside now threatens to take. Most people who love being home are living the first kind, and what they get from it is harder to explain to people who don't experience it, because it doesn't have the obvious, shareable markers that social life has. You can't post a picture of a thought that finally came together. You can't document the specific quality of a Tuesday evening when you're exactly where you want to be, doing exactly what you want to do, with no performance required. The value of that is real, but it's private. And in a world organized around the visible, the shareable, the provable, private value is systematically underestimated. Here's something researchers have been examining in recent years that adds another layer to this. Studies on what's called solitude seeking as an autonomous activity, rather than as withdrawal, have found that people who deliberately choose alone time for self-oriented reasons, not because they failed to make plans, but because they actively wanted the experience of being with themselves, tend to report higher levels of what psychologists call eudaimonic well-being. That's the kind of well-being associated with meaning, purpose, personal growth, and the sense that your life is your own. It's distinct from hedonic well-being, which is more about pleasure and positive emotion in the moment. Both matter, but eudaimonic well-being tends to be a more durable predictor of long-term life satisfaction. And the people who have learned to genuinely enjoy their own company, to find their home environment rich rather than confining, often score well on exactly those measures, not despite their preference for staying in, but potentially because of it. There's also something worth naming about the relationship between home preference and sensory sensitivity. A subset of people who love being home aren't just temperamentally introverted in the social sense, they're also what researcher Elaine Aron described as highly sensitive people, individuals who process sensory information more deeply and thoroughly than average. For these people, a typical busy environment isn't just tiring, it's genuinely overwhelming in a sensory way that's hard to convey to people who don't experience it. Bright lights feel brighter, loud sounds land harder, overlapping conversations require more processing effort. The smell of a busy restaurant, the temperature of a crowded room, the unpredictability of where the next loud thing is going to come from, all of it is being registered and processed at a higher resolution than the average person's nervous system applies. Coming home isn't a social retreat for these people. It's the equivalent of turning the volume of the entire world down to a manageable level, and given what we know about how chronic overstimulation affects cognitive function, mood regulation, and even immune response, the home preference of highly sensitive people starts to look less like avoidance and more like intelligent self-management. Now let's talk about something that the conversation around homebodies almost never addresses: the quality of attention that home allows. When you're out in a social environment, your attention is being distributed constantly. You're monitoring facial expressions, managing your own presentation, tracking the conversational thread, being ready to respond, being aware of background noise, noticing exits, noting social cues. That's not a small cognitive load. Research on social cognition suggests that navigating complex social environments draws heavily on executive function resources, the same finite mental resources you use for planning, decision-making, and sustained focus. For people who spend most of their time in socially demanding environments, those resources are being depleted faster than they're being replenished. The home environment, for someone who's wired to find it restorative, is where replenishment actually happens. And the kind of attention you can bring to things when those resources are restored, the kind of deep, unhurried, fully present attention that produces real understanding, real creative work, real insight, that kind of attention is only available when you're not running on empty. This is part of why many people who love being home describe a paradox that confuses people around them. They often feel more connected to the world, more capable of caring about others, more curious and engaged with life in general, after a long stretch of solitude, than after an equivalent stretch of socializing. The socializing depleted something. The solitude replenished it. The world feels more vivid after you've spent time being still in it. And then there's the ritual dimension, which is worth taking seriously. People who love their home environments often build elaborate, personalized rituals around the space, not necessarily in the formal sense, but in the way that certain sequences of actions have a specific emotional meaning, the particular way they make coffee in the morning, the chair that is specifically their chair, the exact lighting configuration for reading versus watching something versus just thinking, the sounds they use to mark the transition from one part of the day to another. These rituals are not trivial habits. Research on ritualistic behavior suggests that rituals, even informal personal ones, serve a genuine psychological function. They create a sense of order and predictability in environments where the individual has control. They reduce anxiety by making the familiar more reliably familiar, and they mark transitions in a way that helps the mind shift into the right mode for the next activity. For a person who finds the external world unpredictable and stimulating, their home rituals are essentially a technology for staying calibrated. They work, and the person who has built them over years often finds them genuinely comforting in a way that's hard to articulate but very easy to feel. This also connects to something psychologists call place identity, the idea that the spaces we inhabit over time become woven into our sense of who we are. The home of someone who loves being there isn't just a location, it's a psychological environment they've co-created. Every object that stayed, every arrangement that felt right, every corner that became meaningful, all of it reflects something about how that person understands themselves and what they value. Disrupting that environment, being forced to spend extended time outside of it, can produce a low-grade sense of disorientation that's hard to name but very real. The person who seems oddly uncomfortable at parties, not socially anxious in the clinical sense, just somehow less themselves, may be experiencing something as simple and profound as the absence of their place. The version of them that walks in the door after a long social evening isn't just tired. They're arriving back into the context in which they most fully exist. What does this mean for the people in their lives? For the friends who always seem to be making the plans, the partners who wish they went out more, the family members who read the canceled invitations as rejection. It means something important. The person who loves being home isn't choosing between you and their couch. They're managing a genuine resource that depletes in social environments and replenishes in familiar ones. When they say they're tired, they mean it physiologically, not as an excuse. When they say they need the weekend in, they're not being dramatic. When they seem most alive and most present after an evening alone, that's not despite the solitude, it's the result of it. Understanding this doesn't require agreeing with it or living the same way. It just requires taking seriously the possibility that someone else's nervous system works differently from yours, and that different isn't a problem requiring a solution. And this is where we get to something that the popular conversation almost always gets wrong. The assumption that people who love being home are somehow missing something, that their life is a smaller, sadder version of the life they could be living, is built on a very specific and largely unexamined premise, that external activity is inherently more valuable than internal experience, that going somewhere is always richer than staying, that a life measured in events and social encounters is by definition more meaningful than one measured in thoughts, conversations, creative work, and the slow accumulation of deep personal experience in a space you've made your own. That premise is not a fact, it's a cultural bias. And it's a bias that disproportionately costs the people who happen to be wired differently from the social majority. Because here's what the research doesn't tell you to say out loud, but what it clearly implies. When a person who is genuinely thriving in their home environment is repeatedly pressured to be more social, more present, more visible, more out there, the pressure doesn't make them happier. It makes them tired in a specific grinding way. It produces the low-grade shame of feeling like you're doing your own life wrong. It creates a performance of enthusiasm for things that cost you energy rather than giving it, and a private relief when those things end that you've learned not to admit to people because it sounds ungrateful. The person who's finally, quietly, genuinely okay with staying home is often someone who spent years trying to want something different before they stopped apologizing for wanting what they actually want. There's a quality to that arrival that's distinct. When someone has genuinely made peace with their preference for home, without needing to defend it constantly, it often produces a kind of settledness that's visible even to people who live differently. They don't seem to be missing anything. They seem, in the actual observable sense, content. And contentment that doesn't depend on circumstances constantly being a certain way, contentment that can be accessed in a quiet room on an ordinary Tuesday, is a remarkably durable thing. It's arguably more durable than the happiness that requires specific external conditions to be maintained. Let's talk about creativity for a moment, because it belongs here and it's often underemphasized. The relationship between solitude and creative output is one of the most well-documented findings in the psychology of creative work. Study after study in the literature on creative cognition shows that the kind of loose, associative, generative thinking that underlies original ideas requires a mental state that's harder to access under social pressure and external stimulation. The presence of others, even people you like, exerts a subtle normative pressure on your thinking. You process ideas partly through the lens of how they'll land with the people around you. You self-censor. You converge toward the expected rather than diverging toward the surprising. Being alone removes that pressure. The mind is free to wander further, to make stranger connections, to sit with half-formed ideas long enough for them to finish forming. People who love being home spend a lot of time in that mental state. Whether or not they're doing anything that looks like creative work in the formal sense, they are giving the generative capacity of their mind room to run, and over time, that tends to produce something, the insight about the problem that was bothering them, the solution they couldn't see when they were surrounded by people, the idea that actually changes something. These things often happen at home, in quiet, not because quiet is magical, but because it's the context in which a certain kind of thinking becomes possible. And there's one more thing worth naming before we get to what this all actually says about you specifically. There's a loneliness that exists inside constant social activity, that almost nobody talks about, the experience of being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen, unheard, not quite real. This is a different experience from the one people expect loneliness to be. People expect loneliness to live in empty rooms, but a specific sharp kind of loneliness can exist at the crowded table, at the party where you're laughing at the right moments, in the conversation where you're performing a version of yourself that's close enough to the real thing to pass. The person who loves being home often has an acute sensitivity to that gap between the version of themselves that moves through public space and the version that exists when the performance is over. And they've learned, often through a process of trial and error that took years, that the relief of closing that gap, of just being the whole unedited, non-performing version of themselves, is worth more to them than the validation of being visible and socially active. Home is where the performance ends. For people who find performance genuinely costly, that's not a small thing, that's everything. So what does all of this actually say about you, if you've recognized yourself across any of these descriptions? It says that your preference isn't a flaw in your character. It isn't fear wearing a costume of contentment. If you're genuinely energized by your home environment, genuinely restored by solitude, genuinely capable of being deeply engaged and fully alive inside a quiet space with a narrow cast of characters and a rich interior life, you are not living a smaller version of a life. You're living a different version of one, and the fact that it's less visible, less documented, less likely to generate envy in other people, doesn't make it less real or less worth choosing. The value of a life isn't measured in how many rooms you moved through or how many events you attended. It's measured in how fully present you were, how much of it was actually yours, how much of it genuinely fit the person you actually are rather than the person you thought you were supposed to be. The people who have figured that out, at whatever age, at whatever point in their lives the figuring happened, tend to carry something that's very hard to fake, a specific quality of ease with themselves that doesn't require an audience to sustain it. And that ease, that particular kind of self-possession, is something that a lot of people who are still chasing the external life are quietly and privately looking for. They just don't know yet that the place it lives for them might also be somewhere they haven't thought to look. Somewhere quiet, somewhere familiar. Somewhere with the right light and the right sound and the right amount of nothing happening that turns out to be exactly enough. If you've been watching this and something kept catching you, keep that. Whatever landed, whatever made you stop and sit with it for a second, that's worth following. Before the next video, do one thing: subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment telling me what home actually feels like for you when it's at its best. Not the obvious answer, the real one. What's the specific version of being home that you would never cancel on? That comment might be the most honest thing you write today. The people who love being home aren't the ones who gave up on the world. They're often the ones who got clear about what part of it is actually theirs. And that kind of clarity, quiet, hard-won, and deeply personal, is rarer than most people know.